If everybody can find a chair, I think we'd like to get started. I'll give Brian the thumbs up to start recording. And thank city commissioners for making themselves available today for this informational presentation. I'd also like to thank the planning commissioners who were able to attend and welcome them to this informational presentation as well. We wanted to provide an update by way of this meeting about a couple of topics that are somewhat related. The core of the city, of course, that's the core neighborhoods plan, which was recently adopted on a 4-1 vote of the city commission. But in addition to that, we'd like to talk about the city's extraterritorial areas, future growth areas, in light of the FM diversion project becoming a reality. So the presentation today will focus on the core and implementation of the core neighborhoods plan and our ET areas, future growth, mainly the southern ET looking ahead toward completion of permanent flood protection. So this is an outline of the presentation today, as I mentioned, starting out first with the core of the city, and that is the core neighborhoods plan, and then speak about our ET areas, future growth, talk a little bit about permanent flood protection, and then some planning work that's been done out in the ET areas for providing services. Then we'd also like to offer up a couple of recent case studies out in the southern ET. The first being a case study on the Southwest Regional Stormwater Master Plan, and Brenda has a couple of slides that she'll help me out with. And then the second case study is a development called Commerce on I-29, and Nicole has a couple of slides, and we'll speak to that a little bit. And then I'd like to ask Mike Redlinger to talk briefly about the Baker-Tilley Fiscal Impact Study that's being completed, and then finally finish up with discussion, questions, and takeaway from the informational presentation. So the information being presented today is extremely relevant to allow you to be informed and make educated decisions moving forward. So when it comes to either development on the fringe or redevelopment within the core, we have some guides that we utilize. First, we are a home rule city, which is allowed by Century Code. Next, we utilize our growth plan, which was adopted in 2007 and still in use today. We also utilize our comprehensive plan that was adopted in 2011. That's titled Go 2030. That is also still in use today. And I would like to point out that the Downtown in Focus study and the core neighborhoods plan are actually subsets or companion studies to the comp plan. We also utilize our land development code with respect to zoning and subdivision matters. The LDC was adopted in 1998 and is still in use today. And then, of course, floodplain management plans related to construction requirements like river setbacks, building elevations, and floodproofing requirements. And utility services planning, and this applies not just to edge development, but also development within the core, where oftentimes the utilities are either old or undersized or need to be relocated to accommodate the redevelopment plan. We do have frequent communications with the school district and park district to coordinate our plans. And then something that I wasn't aware about when we started this, we also maintain an available lot map to keep a finger on the market, things like housing starts, and to make plans for utility services. So first, a high-level overview of the core neighborhoods plan and strategy for implementation. This is a slide of the plan study area. It included 3 sub-areas, with each sub-area containing 3 neighborhoods. On the north side, the Washington neighborhood, Horace Mann neighborhood, and Roosevelt neighborhood, which includes NDSU. Central, the Madison Lincoln Park neighborhood, Jefferson and Carl Ben neighborhood, and the Hawthorne neighborhood. And then the southern sub-area, the Claire Barton neighborhood, Lewis and Clark neighborhood, and South High neighborhood. So geographically, the study area went from 19th Avenue North on the north end to I-94 on the south end, and from the Red River on the east to 25th Street on the west. So it did include a large portion of the city's core, and wanted to point out that the process included over 60 neighborhood residents participating across 3 different citizen steering committees, and they met regularly throughout the process. And it also included an overarching steering committee comprised of city officials and partner organizations such as the school district and park district. And as I mentioned, the plan was adopted by the City Commission in the spring of 2021. The core neighborhood study looked at the market dynamics of a healthy neighborhood, and that factored into the recommendations that are contained in the study. And so this diagram illustrates the study's conclusions that a positive neighborhood image leads to demand for housing and a strong market within the neighborhood. That in turn leads to increased resident capacity to actively manage and improve homes and the neighborhood. That leads to better physical housing and neighborhood conditions, and that leads to a more positive neighborhood image and so on. And so the goal is to try keep the factors trending in a positive direction to prevent a pattern of disinvestment from occurring. So when CZB was doing their market research, what did they find? Well, when looking at all of the factors that influence market and analyzing the data, they found that compared to newer neighborhoods in Fargo, the core neighborhoods have lower levels of market demand. Similarly, the core neighborhoods contain a disproportionate share of inexpensive housing relative to the rest of the city. And the study concluded that a regional approach to solutions is recommended to avoid the creation of concentrations of poverty that can result in disinvestment in core neighborhoods, and as a result, erode the tax base of the city, school district, and park district. The idea here was to identify and implement a series of tools in an effort to bring all areas of the city into the pink-red color on this map, and that, of course, is when comparing the core neighborhoods to other areas of the city. Here is the series of tools recommended in the core neighborhoods plan to help guide future decision-making, and that includes things like budgeting, capital investment, and resources. And so the recommendations were categorized into 5 topic areas: development, regulation, and incentives, neighborhood leadership and engagement, housing reinvestment, public infrastructure investment, and public health and safety. It's important to point out that a number of the recommendations affect multiple departments and have impact on those departments' budgeting and staffing levels. It also identified a correlation between how we support development in the growth areas and how that affects our older areas like the core neighborhoods. So when looking at our policies, we think it's important to look at it holistically throughout the entire city. Our policies also have an impact on the metro area as well. Extraterritorial jurisdiction is permitted under North Dakota law, and it's used to control and maintain orderly growth. The reason that ET zoning and subdivision laws exist are many, but one of the reasons is to ensure the preservation of future rights-of-way and utility corridors. And that's so that they're available when needed at some point in the future. Initially, it's typical to zone areas within the ET as AG, given agricultural zoning designation. The last time the City Commission extended Fargo's ET boundary was 2006. And it seems like the state legislature is, to some degree or another, taking up ET zoning bills every session. And because of that, things have changed over the years. We've listed some of those things here. After 1977, ET boundaries were allowed to be extended up to 4 miles beyond a municipal's corporate limits. Then in 2007, that was reduced to 2 miles, and then shortly after that, in 2009, that was changed slightly. So the ET boundaries could extend 2 miles beyond the corporate limits, and an additional 2 miles could be added as joint jurisdictional ET. As I mentioned earlier, the geography of the core neighborhood study area was produced based on the economics and market demands of the city as a whole. And this was done so the plan could focus on identifying and bridging any policy or investment gaps that might exist as part of the plan's recommendations. As we look at our south side areas, we consistently refer back to the city's 2007 growth plan that has been used as a foundation for several other master planning activities, whether that's related to support of the diversion and flood protection efforts or the extension or replacement of utilities. And so when looking at the southern ET area, it's important to be mindful of the Tier 1 and Tier 2 designations in the growth plan. This applies to land use planning, utility master planning, transportation planning. And so looking at this map, the light green shading is the southern ET area. The black shaded area obviously is the diversion. The blue boundary represents the Tier 1 area of the growth plan, and the red boundary represents the Tier 2 area of the growth plan. And so with respect to future land development activities, Tier 1 ends roughly at 80th Avenue South. And then the heavy green boundary line that I've just called up indicates what's been developed to date in the Tier 1 growth area since the 2007 growth plan was adopted. And we think it's important to recognize the Tier 1 and Tier 2 areas because the focus right now is servicing areas in a logical way within the Tier 1 area. And until the diversion is completed, development within the Tier 2 area would require extensive mitigation efforts, and I'll explain that in just a moment. The FM diversion project will, in effect, establish a finite growth area to the south, with a good portion of the protected area lying within Fargo's ET boundaries. The planning department has been getting numerous inquiries or interest expressed about potential development out in that area. Some of the inquiries on the extreme southern end of the protected area. So because of that, we started having some internal staff meetings to talk through what challenges we would likely face when being asked about potential development. And we included all departments that typically get involved with development requests. So we had representation from planning, engineering and transportation, economic development, the water utility, wastewater utility, and stormwater utility. This is a slide showing two aerial photos. The one on the left depicts our current existing 100-year floodplain. Obviously, the blue is area inundated with water during the 100-year flood event, and it represents a river stage of 41 feet, which is actually higher than the 2009 flood. In fact, the hydrology that created this map indicates that the 2009 flood, Fargo's current flood of record, is now approximately a 50-year flood in terms of measured flow in the river. And the map on the right shows the 100-year floodplain with the diversion in place. And in the middle, you can quickly see the amount of area that will be removed from the 100-year floodplain. This map represents the new 100-year floodplain based on a river stage of 37 feet flowing through town. And so the point here is, with the completion of in-town levees and floodwall work, the emergency measures would no longer be required for a 100-year flood. And so that'll be a big day. Again, got ahead of myself. Similar slide. This slide shows two aerial photos. The one on the left depicts the 500-year floodplain information. That's based on a river stage of approximately 45 feet. And the one on the right shows the 500-year floodplain with the diversion in place. And that's based on a river stage of 40 feet flowing through town. So the point in this slide is, with the completion of in-town levees and floodwall work, the 500-year flood event could be managed with some level of emergency work. And so as we approach completion of the diversion project, we would like to reevaluate our flood protection development standards, because this directly affects edge greenfield development, obviously, but it affects the core as well. And so example of things to be reevaluated would include areas within the protected area that are still at risk from the 100-year and 500-year floods, the construction of flood protection levees within the growth areas, our elevation standards for structures, the LOMRF requirements within the remaining or residual 100-year floodplain areas, and take another look at our flood-proof basement requirements. So during the interim period or prior to completion of the diversion, we need to be cognizant of state requirements at play here. The state of North Dakota has a policy in place that limits allowable impacts on the 100-year floodplain to a maximum of half a foot. In other words, development can only raise the 100-year profile of the river by 6 inches or less. If construction or development occurs that causes an impact greater than half a foot, then mitigation measures must be taken to mitigate those impacts. And we've completed modeling of the 100-year flood profile to determine a theoretical limit of how far south we can build levees without exceeding that 6-inch limitation. And again, this is prior to completion of the diversion. And so you can see that theoretical line depicted by the red line on this slide. Starting on the right at University Drive, it goes along 76th Avenue South from University Drive to 45th Street, then continues north on 45th Street from 76th Avenue South to 64th Avenue South, and then continues west along 64th Avenue South from 45th Street to drain 27. This slide has the city limits boundary and the ET boundary superimposed on that new 100-year floodplain map. 100-year floodplain on the left and 500-year floodplain on the right. And Fargo's existing city limits are identified by the pink border on the slide, and Fargo's ET limits are identified by the yellow border. So you can see that Fargo's ET boundary extends as far south as Cass County Highway 16, just south of the embankment hump. And you can see on the new left side 100-year floodplain map, there still are some areas of floodplain that remain primarily located between the Wild Rice and the Red Rivers. And so a little bit about utility planning. Oftentimes the first consideration in development is the ability to get water and sanitary sewer service to the area being proposed for development. And as we recognize our geographic limitations and in an effort to manage the servicing of land and plan for orderly growth, the City of Fargo has long-range utility master plans. Started with the overall master plans in 2005. Both those plans were subsequently amended in 2016 due to regionalization efforts, and again in 2019 due to the FM diversion project becoming a reality and the Southwest Regional Stormwater Pond. And so way back in 2005, at the time, we were experiencing difficulties with delivering a sufficient supply of water throughout our water distribution system. At the same time, we were having capacity problems in our two big sanitary sewer interceptors. So we knew that if you placed future growth on top of that, it would only compound the problem. So recognize the need for master planning to not only address our existing system deficiencies, but also position ourselves for future growth and the potential for regionalization at some point in the future. So back in 2005, there were some basic drivers behind the master planning efforts on the wastewater side. We were facing aging infrastructure, wet weather flow problems, population growth, and changing regulations. And on the water side, again, aging infrastructure, a decreasing hydraulic grade line, which relates to ability to deliver water, again, population growth, and the Cass Rural Water Users District. Then in 2016, there was an update to both of those master plans due to an interest in regionalization of our water and sanitary sewer systems. On the sewer side, there was interest expressed from West Fargo, Horace, and Mapleton. And on the water side, there was interest expressed from West Fargo, Horace, and the Cass Rural Water Users District. And then finally, in 2019, there was another update done, essentially due to that finality on the FM diversion project and this concept of a regional stormwater system between 52nd Avenue South and 64th Avenue South, right up next to Drain 27. And so just a little bit of what's been accomplished since 2005. You can see on the sanitary sewer side of things, to date, about a $290 million investment. And it included some major things like a new third interceptor sewer along 45th Street, capacity increases to both our existing West Side Interceptor and Broadway Interceptor, two major sanitary sewer lift stations to serve the new third interceptor, and we finally established a formalized trunk sewer replacement program, and then, of course, the wastewater treatment plant expansion that is ongoing as we speak. On the water distribution side of things, about $190 million investment since 2005, and that included a 6 million gallon ground storage reservoir, two additional water towers, a dedicated 36-inch water transmission line between the water treatment plant and that ground storage reservoir. And then we accelerated our cast iron water main replacement programs, working with engineering. And then, of course, the water treatment plant expansion that is completed and functional now, that increased our treatment capacity from 30 million gallons per day to 45 million gallons per day. I won't spend a whole lot of time on this slide, but the takeaway is to demonstrate the involvement of our planning department early on in the utility planning efforts. So this is a slide showing the growth and land use plans that were utilized in the water and sewer master plan updates. And so this slide shows the ultimate build out of our sanitary sewer interceptors on the left and our water transmission pipelines on the right. And so at this point, our master planning covers future growth down to the south to about 88th Avenue. The next portion of the presentation, we'd like to get into a couple of case studies we'd like to speak to, and I'd like to ask Brenda Derrig, our city engineer, to come up and speak to this. This is our Southwest Regional Stormwater Master Plan and Pond. And so this is an example of where planning and utility service planning were out in front of development. And so, Brenda, if you would, thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. With the impending development, it was imperative that we master plan the stormwater on the southwest side of Fargo. The Southwest Regional Retention Pond provides an affordable infrastructure along with pedestrian-friendly corridors. The regional pond will provide retention and water quality requirements to a large area encompassing 2,300 acres. You can see from the picture on the left, the retention area, which is protected, which is in the flood protected and ET growth area south of Fargo. On the right, we've zoomed in for a view of the regional stormwater pond and the associated drainage swales. This is a case study where the regional growth and utility service plans were out in front of development. This summer, we built the first phase of the retention pond in the northeast corner, which included the lift station along the drain, along with drainage swales to the south, which will eventually be incorporated into the retention pond. And we will continue to add the phases and the drainage swales as development occurs. As part of the stormwater master planning, we added a planning component and worked together on the stormwater regionalization and the associated growth plan amendment that it would support. This is the first time we have added a planning component to our technical study, which proved to be successful. This growth plan was completed earlier this year. By adding the planning component, we were able to design the drainage swales and pond to provide the stormwater retention and water quality requirements that are necessary for the associated zoning. This is very important because, again, the regional stormwater pond meets the stormwater requirements for the 2,300 acres. We will also be looking to work with planning on master planning the southeast area of Fargo, also east of I-29.
Thank you, Brenda. And we'd like to get into the second case study out in that area, which is a development called Commerce on I-29. And this is a case study where development got out in front of growth and utility service planning. And so I'd like to ask Nicole Crutchfield to help out to speak about this development and lessons learned in this case. So Nicole?
Good afternoon. Thanks, Bruce. This case study at Commerce at I-29 was platted and zoned, and the construction permits were issued in 2014. A little bit of the story on how we got here. In 2014, local developers saw an opportunity for industrial development on the south side of town at roughly at 100th Avenue. And however, at this time, that was over 3 miles away from the city limits and also located in the city's extraterritorial area. In addition, the subdivision and the utilities were over 3.5 miles away with no near plans to bring utilities to this area for over 25 years. However, it's everybody's right to submit permits and applications, and so there was a growth plan amendment requested by the developer to change this area from commercial land use to an industrial land use. Staff recommended denial at this time, declaring that the timing of the development cannot be supported by utilities as documented in the growth plan. The Planning Commission and the City Commission did support that denial in the growth plan. However, as a result, revisiting their goals, the developer chose to modify the zoning request with a new application to be in line with the growth plan and use commercial development as such. And this is an effort to negotiate an approval to be supported by the City Commission. So as this area was platted and zoned 7 years after the 2007 growth plan, the area, as Bruce referenced, was in Tier 2 of the growth plan, which meant that the city was not in the foreseeable future providing services for another 25 to 50 years. To overcome the constraints of this, laid out in the growth plan, the developer negotiated a private sewer system built to city standards as a means to satisfy staff's concerns and the elected officials' concerns, and which accommodated the intent of the ordinance. All proceeded as planned with legal documents, developers' agreements, and such, and all parties believed that all was resolved for the predictable, foreseeable future, or until the public utilities could connect. Today, however, as new landowners buy property and as new landowners set their sights on utility demands that far exceed the original proposal, there are no regulations or rules to protect the public interests or abutting property owners. Apparently, we've found some loopholes in the subdivision ordinance. As experienced by property owners in the subdivision and platting and zoning a project like this, NRET provides many constraints, which include not having the ability to provide sanitary sewer services, storm sewer services, or city maintenance scheduling. The sanitary sewer flows to a collection tank, is hauled by the truck for disposal, and is all privately funded and managed. Due to the high demand of the land uses at this location, the constraints of the private designs of the utilities have failed, and the public sector does not have any of the tools to assist to provide relief due to the lack of jurisdictional permissions and ordinances. And as a result, here is the 64th Avenue Tower. So geographically, as you see, as the crow flies, 3.5 miles away.
Nicole, is it true that they've also requested to do continuing building in that area? Do they have to get permits from us if they need to expand?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Mayor. Yeah, today we still have the challenges, and staff spends, including our city attorney and engineering, several hours working with the developers at this location. Some of the unforeseen issues is that the existing landowners split the lots, and so then sells the lots to an unforeseeable owner who doesn't maybe understand the full story of what they can and can't do under the constraints of the private services. So how did we get here? Developers tell us from reasons, some of the reasons on why we should allow properties in the ET, such as Commerce at I-29. As Bruce mentioned, earlier this year, we had several requests in the ET area, which led to some of the discussions and collaboration amongst our fellow departments. The most common issue we hear is a need that there are no existing industrial, multifamily, or commercial lots available in the city to be built upon. Most of our local builders and developers have business plans that depend on turning this land over and putting it in, quote unquote, in production as part of their business needs. We have also heard that the cost of land that is not serviced is more attractive to their development plan, and they would rather pay for private utilities and constructions as a cost savings to them and to the end user. Some more specifics to this argument is that there are a lot of speculative landowners in our community. A majority of the land between city limits, existing city limits, and the diversion is already locked up with promises or rights of first refusals, which we call optioned. And so I think that's the crux of what we hear is as we plan for our future between the edge of city limits and to the diversion, that's some of the constraints and the pressures we're under. Since 2014, Commerce on I-29 was platted and zoned and contains 92 acres. Since that time, the city staff and the elected officials have supported an additional 390 acres of industrial zone land that has been serviced in that period of time within the city limits. So I'll turn it back to Bruce.
Thank you, Nicole. And so there are a number of reasons to try and maintain organized, orderly growth for our community. First, we're trusted to be good stewards of our public resources and to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the community. It's also, we think, important to communicate early on with property owners so they can make informed decisions and aren't operating under false expectations. And we think it's important to ensure necessary corridors are preserved to meet the utility and transportation needs of future users. We certainly want to ensure that we have adequate resources to properly plan, maintain, and manage development. We would like to obviously limit the need for special assessment deferrals. And because infrastructure plans impact multiple jurisdictions, we would like to collaborate with the other jurisdictions using a 5-year planning horizon, and that would include jurisdictions such as the county, school district, and park district. One of the other tools that, I was back a slide, sorry, but one of the other tools that you've likely heard about that we'll soon have in the toolbox is the Baker-Tilley Fiscal Impact Model. And I would like to ask Michael Redlinger to give us an update on the status of that study and let us know when we might expect to see that. So, Michael.
Well, thank you, Bruce. Thank you, commissioners, for the time this afternoon. You'll recall that the Baker-Tilley scope of work was approved back in March of 2021. And since that time, staff has been working with the Baker-Tilley consultant team on getting the groundwork laid for the fiscal impact model. And so there are really two objectives, and I just want to talk about them briefly in this study. The first objective was to create a new model to project fiscal impacts associated with growth. And as you can see on the slide there, we really wanted this to be a durable plan that gave us a 10-year look at new property tax growth. And the question really that we presented to Baker-Tilley was, how do we do that? How do we answer the question about what those fiscal impacts might look like? Well, we do that by creating scenarios in this model for property tax revenue generation and the associated capital construction to make a project happen. And so what we want to pose to a follow-up question at the end of the fiscal impact analysis is, will the cost of infrastructure, will the cost of that road or that piece of trunk utility infrastructure create a return on investment that makes sense to the city, makes sense to our tax base over the long term? The second objective that we want to address in the study is really managing a finite growth area. Bruce mentioned this earlier. The diversion footprint essentially establishes our southern growth boundary for the next several decades. We want to be thoughtful, we want to be mindful, and make sure that we are making the most informed land use decisions and fiscal related decisions that we can in this area. And finally, I would just add that this tool is something that when it gets delivered to us yet this year, we want it to be a tool not only for staff, but really for the elected body as well. This is going to be something that will really provide information to allow the elected board, allow the planning commission to act decisively in the best interest of this finite growth area, and make sure that we get the kind of fiscal return on investment as well as the type of land use we want to see. So it's really helping us create the future that we desire in our growth area. So thank you very much, commissioners.
At the Main Street Initiative, Mike, we had some discussion about Taco John's versus strip malls versus different issues. I'm anticipating what you're going to give to us is it anticipated what neighborhoods work and bring back, in a sense, value to the city of Fargo to pay a cost of everything that we provide in services?
That is correct, Mayor, and that's a great observation because just as you illustrated right there, there are some commercial projects that would maybe make sense, and there's other commercial projects that wouldn't make sense from a utility perspective as well as property tax generation. And so we really want to answer both of those questions about the types of quality of development that we see in that finite growth area. So that's a great observation. Thank you.
And the other thing they had in that presentation is they had certain parts of your community are these huge revenue areas. It's probably not fair to say that the whole city could be all these revenue areas, but we may have centers of revenue basically, and then we must somehow in our residential have some type of model that we might push. I know we did Meadow Creek, or we did down there Bison Meadows. We changed it to have 30, 40, 50-foot lots, a variety of different things. This will help the planning department then help us advise how we plat out neighborhoods?
Absolutely, it will. And we're starting with these 7 defined growth areas. That's what the study scope was really focusing on. But I think the lessons learned here will take us well into the ET territory beyond that, because we're going to know if it's going to be worth the investment of taxpayer dollars in the utility investment to go to some of these areas for that type of development. We want to answer that question clearly and unequivocally. So thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And so we do think that some things are really important when looking at where do we go from here. Number one on the list is to update the 2007 growth plan. Also think it's important to initiate a rewrite of the land development code. And looking ahead, keep cognizant of the 500-year flood protection. We think it's important to manage the extension of our utilities to try to limit the need for throwaway infrastructure, to maintain controlled, orderly growth in the ET areas that achieves the highest and best use of the finite land available for development, as Mike just spoke to. And then finally, there may be times when no is the appropriate answer based on all of the factors that we're discussing with you today. And so that really concludes our informational presentation today, just to give you a feel for things that we'll be dealing with in the immediate future. Before we open it up to discussion and questions, I would like to point out that at the completion of the FM diversion project and the Red River Valley water supply project, the Fargo region will be one of the most resilient areas in the upper Midwest, if not the country. So this is an important point in Fargo's history. So thank you for the time and attention, and the team will be happy to try and answer any questions you might have.
Well, first of all, excellent work by all involved. I really appreciate that for the commissioners, because we are getting asked sometimes to be pushed in different areas and where to go. But this is an excellent review, and I think all your teams have done an excellent job in bringing this forward. And I do think the commissioners have to decide, are we going to leapfrog, not leapfrog? Are we going to keep within our confines? Are we going to do orderly growth plan, or what are we going to do? So I'd open up for any discussion, questions, any commissioner. Commissioner Pepcorn.
Mr. Chair, I have a question for Bruce about the certification of the levy. I guess that's because I know it takes some time with our past levies. What's the timeline? So let's say, obviously, we're beginning construction next year. will it be certified immediately after it's done, or will that take time? That's my first question.
Thank you, Commissioner. And I'll call on Nathan. I believe there is a bit of a time lag, Commissioner. But Nate, certification, you've done a lot of that in your career?
Yeah, great question. This is a rather large project, so I know the Diversion Authority in combination with Fargo Moorhead are going to try and work with FEMA ahead of time of the project being completed to try and make that time period from when the project is completed to when the project is accredited by FEMA as short as possible. But at this point, we don't know that time frame. Hopefully, it's very shortly after the project completion, but it's unknown at this time.
Yeah, but to his point, sometimes when we've had stuff done, it's taken 2 years or 3 years
Yep,
before they
correct.
certify. So Dave's right, can we get that tightened up?
Yep, and that's why we've already engaged with FEMA, having those conversations to make sure that we can make that time period as short as possible.
But that's what we're talking about. To allow construction, we can't allow, even if we wanted to, they still have to follow those higher restrictions until it's certified, in my perspective. I don't know if that makes sense to everybody. Then just one more comment real quick. So that commercial development that we saw way south of Fargo, the thing that concerns me is 50 years from now, do you know who's going to be blamed for the infrastructure and held accountable for it all and have to maintain it all and all that? Us. And so that's very concerning when that happens and it's out of our control. And a long time from now, we're going to have to be the ones maintaining it. And so that's, I don't know what we can do to resolve that issue, but that's a legitimate thing that at the end of the day, we're the ones, you know, and so I think that's frustrating to staff as well. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
So, Nicole, this might be a question for you. In regards to the space between the diversion and our current ET line, is that within the 2-mile ET territory so that we could bring it in, or would it be the code jurisdictional area?
Some of that is in code jurisdictional area, it's not all entirely in the city of Fargo's ET right now, but we are talking with the Diversion Authority and other leaders to see about an annexation plan and an ET ordinance expansion plan to get the south side, especially the south side diversion, all within the city of Fargo jurisdictional limits. That's right now just in the preliminary stages, and as we work with the attorneys and timelines and look at all the potential scenarios.
Thank you. I'm just curious about, as our city's footprint grows, are we also in a corollary sense anticipating emergency medical fire response for those growths, and how does that get timed into this planning?
Would that be a new emergency coordinator that we're hiring?
Actually, Mayor and Commissioners, that's a great question, Commissioner Strand. And one thing that our Baker Tilley study will do is start to answer that question about the kinds of per capita numbers just based on historical practice that we've had to have to grow the fire department, to grow public safety. That's a question we want to get to on the general fund side then of operating expenses to support that kind of growth. We also think the companion staffing boost has got to be X, Y, and Z. So that will be a question that we address in that study, and we'll look forward to that result. But that's a great question. Thank you.
Bruce, can you go back one slide that shows the, those. So, you know, as I'm looking at that, I know that we've had some conversations about just not extending utilities and that being part of the solution here. But that last bullet point there, it just seems to make sense to me, and this is probably more of a question to the rest of the commission, that we notify the development community that that's going to happen. We're going to say no to projects if you come in with something that doesn't match with the long-term growth plan. I guess that's more of a statement than a question, but it's something for the commission that if we develop and put forth some kind of policy statement that says, you know, we're going to abide by this, so that people aren't going out and buying land and expecting that leapfrog development.
I think what we're asking out of this brown bag, Bruce, are we going to eventually have a policy discussion at the commission that the commission would endorse? So developers would know that here's where we're staying, here's our rules, here's where we're staying, this is what we're going to do.
Well, and after the informational presentation, our staff team are going to talk about that a little bit. So I asked our planners and our engineers, what do we want as a takeaway from commissioners coming out of today? And what they asked me to share with you is that ask for support of the recommendations that they'll see in front of you, because it's really based on a lot of factors, and nobody enjoys saying no, but we're doing it for the right reasons. And so they're asking for consideration of their recommended motion on these.
Mr. Chair, just a couple of quick things, and this is kind of for Nicole on page, I think it's 24, where the developer statements, I don't know if you can put that back up, where they say no industrial lots are available and they're frustrated. I think the correct statement would be there are no more cheap lots available. And I think that's what a lot of developers are looking for, inexpensive, and it's times are going to change. And to me, from the city commission's perspective, all that land between South Fargo and the end of the diversion, that's it for us. And I think we have to be very careful how it all goes, how it develops. And I think this is, it's going to be very valuable and more valuable. And I don't think we should be in a rush. I guess that's the main thing. And the other thing, that the target neighborhoods, I think that's it's like a heat map. It shows where we should be focusing our efforts. There's some of those neighborhoods, and we've had different reviews, that needs the most attention from my perspective. We need to help those turn around. And this is a good time because real estate values are very high. And so if we turn them around, that can be very valuable. So I think that also has showed up in that one of the pages shows there's some of our neighborhoods that need the most attention. That's where we should focus our efforts. And from my perspective, the land between the edge of South Fargo and the diversion, we need to go very slowly, because that's the long term of our city. All right, I'm sorry for my sermon, but I think that's all right. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Nicole, do you want to give us the final thought?
Well, I'm not sure if there was a question there, Commissioner Pepcorn, or not. I would concur.
No, I guess my question is, if you can put that page up, just talk about that. I mean,
Sure.
Basically they say, well, there's none available. And my perspective is, it's a different time. So and I'm sorry for.
I
go
think
ahead.
if you saw the previous version of this slideshow, you would have seen, instead of less expensive, cheap land. And we decided to use, a little bit more maybe etiquette in our discussion point. But I think we, talk with developers all day long, or potential property owners, and there's all different types of developers, and I think that's the important thing to remember. And it's a case-by-case scenario, so we can't, I want to be careful we don't lump everybody all together. However, just because some things might be viable or feasible in Bismarck or in other parts of the city or the state that have different geographical or geological constraints, I think one thing that makes our properties very unique is it's in the Red River Basin, and we have some really interesting utility issues to overcome. And so as a result, that adds cost to land, and we want to be very mindful as well. And I'm not saying just because we're flat, we're expensive, but I think it's the idea that as we kind of collaborate with developers. And so one of the things that we started seeing more and more last year and into today in terms of how the development process works overall, we could probably have a whole brown bag on this, but generally landowners or developers or potential landowners will ask to meet with the staff and share their ideas with them. And when we start to share the growth plan language, the ordinance language, things like that, they're not liking what they hear, and they want to continue with their plan. And so they've refrained from actually applying for applications because they know first on that staff's going to recommend denial. We're starting to see requests from attorneys, requests from people looking for more information as open records requests, things like that, as developers start to dig in a little bit to find out what those constraints and if they're legal, et cetera. And so those are new legal challenges we usually haven't had to deal with in the past, and the discussions and development have been more in collaboration. But staff gets smarter and smarter every day in terms of problems we see, and so yes, that's why we started to see concerns as staff, as there's some new thinking out there in the community that thinks we're not sure what they're dealing with. But I think one of the things we'd like to do with the Planning Commission, I know, and we've talked about this with the City Commission, is start to have roundtables with developers and listening sessions to understand what really is their point. And I think that last bullet, less expensive land is available elsewhere in the metro area. Knowing that we're competing with Dilworth, Horace, some of our Barnesville, Castleton, I think that's okay. And that's a mentality that maybe we haven't had in the past, that it's okay. And there's some properties and land that is better in other cities or more in their business plans. But I think we need to be understanding that the central of this ring of the metro area lands in Fargo, and we end up carrying a lot of that burden as a metro as well.
Go ahead,
ahead.
John. Sorry, you've been waiting.
Nicole or Bob, Bruce or whomever, I'm just curious. Now, we're seeing Fargo, and we're seeing Fargo's extraterritorial footprints, and we're, of course, connecting the dots, the implication of the impacts of the diversion coming to us. What I don't see here, and maybe it's because it doesn't exist, but I believe it probably does, is our neighbors. I don't know what our neighboring communities' footprints look like, what their extraterritorial looks like, what their boundaries look like. And I guess my question is this: is the left hand and the right, are the left hand and the right hand talking to each other? Are we in that capacity with our neighboring communities, especially with the diversion coming and growth opening up? Are we talking to each other, and is there shared planning?
Commissioner Strand, great question, and the answer is yes, we are. And one of the beauties of regionalization is because Fargo is the purveyor of water and sewer services, there is no choice, but both West Fargo and Horace, maybe not so much the Moorhead side, but West Fargo and Horace, we're forced in, we don't have to be forced into it, but we're forced into collaboration on the utility front, which wraps all the rest of this in.
And I think, Nicole, what you were saying, and even your question there, John, is that we are entering this era where the land south of us is going to get more expensive. And it's also going to limit us in the future. I'm looking forward to that fiscal impact study, because it very well may show us that our growth is funding our current reinvestment in the core, and back to the core neighborhood plan issue. So it's so important, it seems to me, that we get beyond this growth. Any kind of growth is good growth, and that we begin to understand that it's got to be the highest and best use of the land as far as we can. And hopefully that will ensure the financial sustainability of the city in the next 50 years, 60 years. So being able to stick to that we are committed to this highest and best use, and try to steer growth and developers in that direction.
Bruce, since it's getting close to 1 o'clock, you can wrap it up.
No, thank you for the comments, questions, and we as a team will talk a little bit about a policy discussion that might help us get there, and obviously be back to you. But the one thing I like about informational meetings, it's a single topic, so you can stay focused for a full hour on one topic. And that being said, I'd like to keep it to an hour out of respect for your time. So thank you once again for making yourself available today. Planning commissioners for sitting in on this as well. I hope you took away some good information. Some of this stuff you probably hadn't seen before, so thank you.
Will you send this in an electronic file?
Yes.
Please? Thank you.
So the good thing